On behalf of the Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard and the Harvard Law School Library, I would like to welcome you to this one of a series of book talks. My name is Jonathan Zittrain. I direct the library here and teach cyber law, and am a sometime and current colleague of Larry's and in a spiritual sense, student of his. But this isn't just a book talk, although it is that. We're talking about Republic Lost 2.0. Even More Lost is the subtitle. Still in the desert. But in between Republic Lost 1.0 and Republic Lost 2.0, a very intriguing thing happened. My colleague Larry Lessig ran for President of the United States of America. Between this group and the listeners of C-SPAN, we may have a majority of Americans already on board. I also want to welcome our friends from C-SPAN who are recording this, and that's a chance to alert you that anything you say or do will be broadcast and in rerun indefinitely. But it's amazing you ran for president, Larry.
I did do that. That's right. Yeah.
And so the inartful way of asking the follow-up would be, what are you thinking? Mm-hmm. But the more artful way of asking it would be, how did you come to the place where you said, you know what, I think I'm going to run for president?
Well, as you know, Jonathan, you are responsible for that decision. Because, of course, we had long conversations about this decision before I made it. And what I laid out to Jonathan was a sense, which is not uncommon, especially, I guess, among the people who are here, that we are at a point in the arc of the history of our democracy, maybe on the way down, where we've got to come to recognize a fundamental flaw has evolved or emerged inside of our democracy. I think I talked about it during the campaign in a too abstract way. I want to be very particular. That flaw is an institution called Congress. Congress is a failed institution, And it's crippled and corrupted by the corrupting influence of money, by the way in which we've denied equal representation through gerrymandering, through all the mechanisms by which this institution no longer represents the American people. And the reality, of course, of our government is we need both Congress and the president to be able to work together to get anything done. So what I feared as I saw this election emerging is that we were going to have a typical presidential race.
So around when was this?
I think, this is like June and July.
June and July, this summer.
Yeah.
Yep.
As we saw this emerging presidential race, it was going to be like every presidential race. These candidates were going to talk about all the amazing things they were going to do, promise the moon. But the rocket can't get off the ground. And the rocket can't get off the ground because the essential institution to do any of the things that they're talking about doing, whether it's dealing with climate change or dealing with minimum wage or dealing with health care or dealing with student debt, any of these issues requires Congress. And so if we don't have a campaign focused on this corrupting influence that makes it impossible to get anything done, we weren't going to be able to bring about the mandate, the political mandate, to actually achieve that kind of change. So the conversations that you and I had was A, recognizing that, B, then saying, well, what if we tried to hack this process by launching a race for president which at least had the chance to be able to get into the debates and present this case in a way that might have the opportunity to shift the direction of at least the democratic debate to build the recognition of this essential reform that was needed. And so the calculation was, what would it take to get to those debates? And that was the upside. And then the downside, of course, was everybody thinking I was insane. The incredible personal cost and cost to my family and all of that. I mean, all the downside is there. But the one you and I had the longest conversation was everybody's going to think you're insane. So there was this moment, I don't know if you remember this distinctly, you left my office 2 minutes later, you came back and you sat down and you said, okay, I've decided you're going to run. And I said, well, what do you mean? How have you decided that? You said, well, because you're going to recognize that if the only thing holding you back is the belief that people are going to think you're silly or crazy, that's never going to be enough reason for you not to take this risk. And it was true at that moment. I kind of recognized I had no good reason not to take this risk if that was the only potential downside. So that's basically when we decided I would do it. So thank you.
You're welcome. And it all went according to plan. I want to make sure we cover 3 distinct areas in the roughly 1 hour we have with each other, plus a reception downstairs that may have somewhat modest repast, so I don't want to cause a stampede afterwards, but you're on notice. The 3 areas are, first, a chance to crystallize, in a way for the record, your sense of the problem and the solution and what you've even learned in the wake of this attempt at a solution. So that analytic thing. Second, your sense of the mechanics of running for president and what we all might learn from that and what it says about the state of politics and our democracy in 2015. And third, a chance to get some of the personal color to it, a real sense of the conversations you had, not just with me, but with many others, some of the actual reactions. We'd, I think, love to immerse in that a little bit, and these don't need to be 3 separate things. We can take them all as we go. But maybe a way into it is to say, once you decided that you wanted to do it, in part to get a message out through the debates at the very least, what's the next set of phone calls most important to place to try to do it? I mean, the understanding we have right now is kind of a combination of Schoolhouse Rock and Frank Capra. It's just like you find a podium and announce your run. But what really happened?
Well, so in late July, early August, we made a series of telephone calls, some to the Democratic people in the Democratic Committee.
And I should stop you there because this is the wonderful candidate thing of saying we.
Yeah.
Does that mean you, or you already had a team?
No, there's a team.
Okay.
And they started making telephone calls to feel out how the party would react. And the person we talked to inside of the Democratic Committee was like, geez, they'd probably welcome this. Because at that stage they were thinking, how do we multiply the number of people who might challenge Bernie? Because Bernie was the biggest threat perceived to be to Hillary. So I think they were open to the idea.
So the committee basically was standing for Hillary.
Well, they wouldn't say that, and they wouldn't acknowledge that. But what they said is the signal was that they would be open to this idea. And then at the very same time, they released this standard for getting into the debate, which was 3 polls at 1% 6 weeks before the debate. And we just did some back-of-the-envelope calculations of what it would take to get enough media to get to that place that we could be confident to have that support necessary to get into the debate. And so with this point, we decided to go forward. Everything was about what stunts could we pull to get enough attention, to get enough people focused on this issue so that at least a slice of them, 1%, would say, yeah, this is the person we want to support so I can get into the debate.
So this is a substantive version of the D's nuts theory.
That's exactly right. But he was much more successful than I was, right?
There's a lesson in that, too. But so this is a good moment to say, all right, you had to hone a message designed to reach low information voters early on in the process. They're not yet even focused on this. And so let's just jump back then to your core message. We already heard a kind of rehearsal of it. Congress is broken, but go one more layer on it. What was the problem and what was the fix?
Well, the message that resonates with the people as we find them most is that money has corrupted our political process. I think that's too simple, even though I think I've written 2 books that try to say nothing more than that. But I think that's too simple. But that's the message that out of the box we wanted to hit. Like everybody, literally 90% of Americans believe that money has corrupted the political process, Republicans and Democrats alike.
And these aren't just straight bribes, you're saying.
No, it's
you're
the whole
talking
process.
About the process.
Yeah, it's the process itself, that they focus too much of their time on this tiny slice of the 1% who are funding elections. So in the current election cycle, 158 families have given half the money that's been contributed to the super PAC and candidates so far. That's a banana republic democracy. That's not an American democracy. And this is the thing that immediately would resonate with people, that's the issue they would care about. So that's the substantive issue. But then, there's two versions of the history of the campaign. Not a long campaign, so it's not going to take long to explain it. But, one is we had this all figured out in advance story, and the other is we just stumbled into it in the following way. Let me tell it as if we had it all figured out in advance. The question was, again, how do I get out there in a way that gets the news media, which is this completely bastardized infrastructure today relative to when I was a kid, but anyway, this thing called cable news.
Because it knows nothing.
Well, it knows nothing, and
Jon
it's got
Snow,
two... That's right.
Bastard.
Yeah, it's... too subtle even for us. Okay. The problem with it is the attention span of cable news is, 2 or 3 or 4 minutes. So the question is, what trick can you do to make it interesting enough for them to want to talk and listen to you? And so, I originally launched this with a plan that, when you think about it, I think makes perfect sense. A plan I wrote about in the first version of that book and the second version too, which is what I wanted to be was, in effect, a referendum on this problem.
A vote for you is a vote saying this problem has reached such a critical dimension that nothing else can be fixed or matters until we fix this problem.
Right. And so we are saying, we the people voting for Lessig's candidate are saying, we want this issue fixed first, and if nothing else happens, this is the thing that's got to happen. And so if I'm running as a referendum, what seemed to follow was that once that's done, I had to step aside. Right? So that, as a matter of logic, kind of played.
Once you were done not winning the presidency,
right.
but done implementing, basically, there's a statute you've got. I don't know if it's in the book, the statute.
No, it's not in the book. Yeah, but the statute, right.
And it's not a secret statute.
Nope, it's a real statute. It's not TPP. It's...
You're referring to the trade treaty, the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Which has just become public, right. But it's called the Citizen Equality Act. But the point is, that statute is what we would enact. And once that was enacted, it seemed to follow from this idea of being a referendum candidate that I would step down.
And just to be clear, Congress would feel great pressure to pass it when otherwise it absolutely wouldn't, since it would divest its current donors of their power. It would do that because the referendum had spoken and because they want you out?
It could be.
Yeah.
I mean, the deep strategy to how you would play that is that once you got there, you would act like a crazy man, right? It's like every week, a new CIA secret revealed, right? The point is, quickly, they would be like, what can we do to get rid of this man? And that would be the incentive to get them to pass the act. But not just that, right? It would be... the idea was, as we described it, there would be candidates running for Congress,
Another Area 51 tour will go on if you don't pass this act.
If you want to know the real story of Area 51, it's... But the idea is we would also have candidates running for Congress who would say, look, I'm a referendum candidate too. I will vote to pass this, so that if you raise the significance, the salience of this issue, as we thought the presidential campaign would, there would be enough of a political mandate to actually force Congress to do something which it's almost impossible to imagine them doing otherwise. Okay, but the point is that seems to entail is that once it's done, there's no reason for me, the referendum candidate, to be there anymore. I would step aside. That's the way the mandate was constructed. Okay, now the advantage of that structure was that first, it was so weird, every cable news show wanted to talk about it. But the problem with that is that it was so weird that every cable news station wanted to talk about it for exactly 3 minutes. Okay, so it's not possible in the context of the 3-minute conversation about this for people to understand the motive, what it would be solving, why it made sense, and why it made sense then to step down. Instead, every time I would talk about it, we would spend half the time talking about, whoa, wait, you're going to resign? You're just getting elected to resign? I mean, so who's the vice president? And I would be, no, wait a minute. I'm not getting elected to resign. I'm getting elected to pass the most important democracy legislation in 50 years. No, forget that. What about the resigning part? You want to resign then, right? So the point was it was very hard in the structure of that to get them to focus on, the real objective of the campaign.
And just quickly, who would be the vice president?
Yeah, I'm not going to tell you that. No.
There'd be a secret vice president.
Yes, right. TPP would be the vice president, right? Yeah. But so, there would be, this process was both, helpful in the sense that it got lots of attention to the campaign, but hurtful in the sense that it didn't help people to understand exactly how this could work. And so as this was happening, the number of people who knew about the campaign's going up. So the ultimate objective of getting to the 1% to be able to get into the debates was being achieved, but it made it harder and harder to talk about the campaign as something anybody could understand because it's just something completely different from what anybody running for president has ever tried to do.
So what happened? I don't mean... I'm saying this was a strategy. You're getting awareness. Are you polling at 1%?
Right. So here was the first totally unexpected problem. So we were encouraged. We said we would measure the support for the campaign by doing a kind of extraordinary fundraising challenge. So we had to raise $1 million in less than 30 days. Successfully raised $1 million.
How much did you know ahead of time that you could hit the million? Did you have people ready to say,
no.
We've got your back?
No, because remember, it's at relatively small numbers. It's not like you could get a billionaire to say, I'll give you $1 million. You have to raise it in $2,500.
Because this is for the campaign, right. Not for a PAC or something.
It's not a super PAC.
So you're basically like Dr. Good, and you're like, I need $1 million,
That's right.
And I will save the Republic.
Sort of like that, yeah. That's not how I thought about it, but okay, if you want to think about it like that, that's fine. So we launched that, and we said if we got that, that would demonstrate real support for the campaign. We got to $1 million in less than the 30 days.
And it's worth noting for the record, how did it compare to the fundraising?
I was about to note that for the record, yeah.
This is the part where Larry gets passive-aggressive for no particular reason.
Except...
we call it a presidential temperament.
Yeah. So at that point, that means that I raised more than 2, maybe 3 at that point of the Democratic candidates, more than 5 of the Republican candidates. So we thought, in a world where money matters so much, this is a way of saying it's a real serious campaign, right? And we thought that once we were there, the Democrats would do what the Democrats had done for every other candidate, which is to say, welcome to the race, Larry, and may the best man or woman win, right? But there was crickets from the Democratic Party after we hit the number and said I was going to run. And we inquired, we said, can we talk to somebody there? Because, when every other candidate launched, there was a big announcement from the Democrats welcoming into the race. And so originally I thought, well, this is just symbolic. But then the polls were not including my name in the polls. So there's this catch-22. If you have to get to 1% in the polls, but the polls aren't including your name, it's a little bit hard to get to the 1%.
And how many different polling outfits are there?
So there's 2 kinds of polls, basically. There's robo-polls or internet polls and interview polls. And so among those, there's probably 8 polling companies that are countable.
And both you thought would count as far as achieving 3 1%?
No, we knew it would only be the interview polls.
Only the interview polls.
Yeah,
okay.
But it was only like PPP that was including my name originally.
Public policy polling.
And when they originally included my poll at the end of August, I was qualified. They found me at 1%. So that's why we thought it was plausible. But it was really hard to fight to get the other ones to include. And so as we came to the first debate, Politico did this piece where they'd done the numbers. They'd said if he'd have been in all the polls, he would have been at 1%, but he wasn't in the polls, so he wasn't at 1%. And people were, kind of frustrated. Bloomberg did this very powerful editorial, which is, whatever you think about his crazy campaign, it's kind of outrageous that he wouldn't be allowed in the debates. But I, technically, according to the rules, didn't hit the numbers for the first debate, so I was excluded from the first debate.
And who did they ask about in the polling that was done? I assume they asked about O'Malley and Webb
and Chafee,
and Sanders, and
Cuomo, and Biden, and a whole bunch of people who are not
despite
running.
the fact that their announcements had not gotten widespread coverage, their announcements of running.
Well, Webb and Chafee, right?
No, I mean Biden,
Biden
and Cuomo.
Yeah, Biden and Cuomo you didn't hear. Yeah, I didn't hear about it either. But apparently, no, it's not right. They were not.
So wait,
candidates.
they weren't running.
They were
and
not
they were
running.
still being polled.
That's right.
Would they have shown up at the debates if
Yes.
they had gotten 1% in these polls
Well, they were
without
getting,
running?
Yeah, they were getting the numbers. I mean, they were just, the question was, who would they include? And their view was, we got a right to include whoever we want.
Well, so did you talk to the polling people and be like, look, if you're going to include Cuomo,
many people talked to the polling people.
What'd they say?
They said, we get to decide.
That seems somewhat conclusory.
Yeah, well, they decided. So that was the first debate. But the second debate, we were really optimistic because we were beginning to hit the poll numbers. And we're going to do this quick because I don't want to talk about this part much because it's like the boring part of the story. It's not the important thing. The important thing is the issue and what we have to. Okay, but here's the boring part of the story. So we were hitting the poll numbers. Monmouth had us at 1%. Monmouth is exactly the kind of poll that was supposed to count. NBC found us at 1%. And then we got a notice from my campaign manager got a call from the Democratic committee that said, actually, the rule is not 3 polls within 6 weeks. The rule is 3 polls at least 6 weeks before the debate.
Uh-huh.
And he's like,
and how close is the debate at that point?
2 weeks away. So he's
so
basically,
without the help of Doctor Who.
That's right. And Doctor Who didn't answer the phone. So at that point, when they were told that, we were like, well, wait a minute. Here's the explicit statement of the chairman of the Democratic Party that that's not the rule, the opposite. And they said, well, whatever, this is the rule according to it. And it was on the basis of that, when it was clear I couldn't be in the second debate, that I had to decide whether it made sense to continue. And, there are a lot of people here who are working incredibly hard for the campaign, but I didn't think I could ask them to continue to work if it made no sense because there's no chance to be in the debate. So that weekend is when I made the decision to withdraw. And then there was a big uproar because people were a little bit frustrated that they would change the rules midterm and exclude from the debate. And then CBS then the following week, less than 10 days before the debate, announced their version of the rules, which were different again, which was now, it's not 1%, it's 1%, it's greater than 1% in 3 polls, not 6 weeks before, but 5 weeks, crafted precisely to exclude the third of the polls that found me at 1%, within a couple hours. Like they said, by 12 o'clock on a certain day. So a friend of mine said, well, we got a little bit of Larry Mandering going on here. And so it was clear that, CBS neither would include me in the debate. So that's when the campaign ended.
Wow. All right. So problem, solution. That's what you want to talk about.
Yeah.
Tell us about it.
Well, so analytic solution here is not hard to figure out, right? So when I was obsessing about the way campaigns were funded, I now see that I was missing a pretty important part of that story.
And by campaigns, you mean both congressional and presidential campaigns, or congressional?
Mainly, I care about Congress.
Congress.
And the important part of the story that's missing is, or it's not recognizing, is the reason why the way we fund campaigns is such a terrible problem is because of the basic inequality that it introduces into our system. Like, this is a representative democracy. The one idea that the idea of representative democracy embraces is the idea that we are equal citizens, that we are supposed to have a democracy where we as citizens are equal participants. But where you have a system where members of Congress spend 30 to 70% of their time raising money from the tiniest fraction of the 1%, they can't help but be more focused and concerned with the interests of that tiny fraction of the 1%. So that's a system where this basic equality is denied. And once you think of, sorry.
I was just going to say, and that is, in some ways, you're saying a comparatively new problem. This is not like it's pretty much been this way for the past 50 or 100 years.
Right. I think, and the book really works to show this, I think that the nature of this problem has radically changed in the last 20 years. That it's not that money hasn't mattered. Money has always mattered. But the idea of members of Congress in this, kind of Skinner box-like existence, like constantly pecking on those telephones to get the money they need to fund their campaigns, that psychological experience is relatively new. And what it does is create an institution that is incredibly sensitive to how it can make the funders of campaigns happy. And what that must mean, given that we are not all funders of campaigns, is that they're not as interested in how to make the rest of us happy. Right? So that's an expression of inequality. But it's not the only expression of inequality in our system. Right? So think about the way districts are gerrymandered. Out of 435 seats in the House, maybe 90 are competitive. I mean, 538 thinks that's about twice as many as are competitive, but let's say 90 are competitive, which means 345 seats are safe seats. And what it means to be a safe seat is if you're a Democratic voter in a Republican safe seat, your congressperson doesn't care at all about you because there's...
You're still the politician.
Yeah,
that's very good.
It's a C-SPAN. Because that politician knows that your vote can never matter, that the only votes that are going to matter in a safe Republican seat are Republican votes. The only votes that are going to matter in a safe Democratic seat are Democratic votes, which means if you're the minority in any of those districts, your votes don't matter, which means in America, 89 million Americans have effectively no representation inside of Congress because they are in the minority in these
And it doesn't
seats.
just push the competition into the primary, where the primary then becomes hotly contested?
Right. And when it pushes it into the primary, what it does is amplify the polarized nature of Congress even more. Because when you're a Republican and you're only afraid of the primary challenge, what that means is you're only afraid of the far-right primary challenge. And when you're a Democrat and you're only afraid of the primary challenge, it means you're only afraid of the far-left primary challenge, because those are the people who show up to primary votes. So what this system does is that it amplifies the polarization of America. It makes it a more polarized institution than actually America itself is.
Now, just a somewhat technical question on this. Given that we have a little bit of A/B testing, we've got two chambers of Congress, and one of them isn't elected by district, would you expect then to see differences between the House and the Senate?
Yeah, I mean, not as much, because still you've got fixed borders and not multi-member seats. I mean, the alternative to this, which is what the Citizen Equality Act pushes, is the idea of multi-member districts, which is what our framers had. We had multi-member districts for Congress. And ranked choice voting, or some system of allowing multiple choices for voting. So that means that you could produce basically a representative Congress just by changing the way
this solves the Sophie's Choice problem. This is saying you can send both kids to summer camp, i.e. Congress. It would be the person who wins and the runner-up? That would basically be the idea?
You basically would say if you had 5 seats, you're going to elect 5 representatives. You get your 5 votes and you rank them, and the 5 people who get those would be the representatives. But the point is, whatever the particulars of it is, we could easily construct a system that would be more representative, which would, again, address this deep inequality in the system. And the third dimension, which is kind of the most grotesque and ridiculous, is that we allow within our system these plainly, intentionally discriminatory burdens like voter ID rules, which make it harder for some people to vote than others. As the Brennan Center determined in their view of the 2014 election, it's tied directly to race. So if you are an African American in Ohio, it's harder for you to vote than if you're a white person in Ohio. Even though Ohio after 2004 got something like $3 billion for new voting machines, in white districts they got more voting machines, and in black districts it turns out they have fewer voting machines. Right? So this is a decision driven not by race necessarily. It's driven by politics, which of course correlates with race. But the point is, this places a burden, which is, again, an unfair, unequal burden, when, you've got to wait 30 minutes to vote. If you're a rich person with a nanny and an iPhone, that might not be a problem. But for most Americans, that's a poll tax that you just can't afford to pay. So that's another dimension of this inequality. And so what the campaign tried to say is, look, we have a corrupted Congress, crippled and corrupted. It cannot address any of the issues it needs to address. Corruption is the disease, but equality would be the cure. If we could embrace a principle of equality, political equality, I'm not talking about economic equality, I'm not talking about any equality other than political equality. If we could embrace the idea of equality inside the system, that equality would break up the mechanisms of corruption that make it so hard for this institution to then function.
And that's what the mechanism of the Omnibus Citizens Equality Act is meant to be.
Yes.
So it's got solutions that speak to that.
Each of these three, the way we fund campaigns, the way we gerrymander districts, the way we suppress the votes of people unfairly, unequally,
yes, is
addressed in the Citizen Equality Act, which was really, we didn't write any new statutes. We took these proposals that were out there for dealing with each of these things separately, and we just wrapped them together and said, look, the principle here is a principle as old as this republic, even though never recognized, perfected in this republic, the principle of equality. And that principle, if we just embraced it in a representative democracy, could begin to get us back a democracy that could be responsive to what people cared about.
Now, it sounds like Hillary and Bernie, and perhaps the others as well, it's possibly even helpful for them to run against Congress. As you've pointed out, Congress is not exactly very popular right now, so it's not staking out a radical position to point out that it's corrupted or broken. Is this the kind of act they could at least get behind if asked, would you support this act, or if it arrived on your desk, would you sign it?
Well, see, this is one of the kind of deep corruptions of the process that I didn't no clue of until I got into the middle of it. The primary process is a process of winning over powerful party members to support your campaign. Who are those powerful party members? They are members of Congress. So if you're going to go out there as a candidate running for president in party primaries and be successful with these people, it's not an effective technique to stand up there and say the problem with American democracy is you guys, Congress, right? Because those are the people you're trying to win over. Now, some of those people, actually agree with that. Many of them, there are great leaders in Congress who see the problem of Congress who would say, absolutely, Congress has become the broken institution in our government. But not many of them like to think of themselves or their institution as the broken institution of American government. So it's not a great strategy. And what's striking is, I studied these debates that I was not allowed to be a part of, but I've studied them very carefully. There is no point at which any of those candidates ever talk trash about Congress, never say anything about Congress. And what's so...
How about the campaign finance system?
Well, they do, but this is what's frustrating. Even as that issue is now being surfaced, it's being surfaced as if the issue is which of the presidential candidates is virtuous and which is not. As if the problem is presidents. As if we just had a president who was not corrupted, we would have a democracy that worked. But look, Barack Obama didn't back away from the public option in Obamacare because he'd been bought off by the insurance companies. That's not what that was about. Barack Obama backed off of the public option because Congress was in a place that it realized it couldn't survive, Democrats couldn't survive, because of the money that would come in and affect the elections of Congress. The corrupted institution is Congress. But even right now in these Democratic debates, everybody's speaking as if the question is, who is the virtuous one? And my view is, it doesn't matter at the level of the president anymore, right? It doesn't really matter. Because whether you're Hillary or whether you're Bernie, the issue is going to be whether there's a Congress that can do anything for you, and that's only going to be addressed, that's only going to be achieved if we actually direct the energy of this campaign towards fixing this corrupted Congress.
Which is why you saw a referendum candidacy as the crucial element.
Right.
So in the wake of what happened, what's moving this forward 2.0 look like? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, right? I mean, there are people who've taken up the idea of the Citizen Equality Act and want to continue to build support for that as the framing notion. And I'm all in favor of that, and I encourage and support it as much as I can. But I think, we as citizens have to kind of step back and recognize there's a kind of missing part to our democracy, right? If the president goes nuts or starts misbehaving, there's an institution that can do something about it. Congress can impeach the president. If the Supreme Court starts going crazy, Congress can pack the court or give the president the power to pack the court, or they can impeach the justices. Like, there's a way to deal with the problem of the president or the problem of the courts. But there's no mechanism in our system for dealing with a broken Congress. Congress isn't going to fix itself. The president doesn't have an incentive to take on Congress, because if you take on Congress, you're taking on your own party. You take on your own party, you pretty much guarantee there's nothing you're going to get passed. If you get nothing passed, you're a one-term president. So the president can't take it on. The court's not going to take it on. Congress is not going to take it on. Who's going to take it on? Right? There's a very important...
And presumably the voters won't be reached by the message that...
The voters don't elect Congress. The voters elect members of Congress, right? And so if you look in this politically gerrymandered system and you said, voters, help us overthrow this corrupted Congress, most of them live in districts where they realize that means they've got to vote for a Democrat, or that means they have to vote for a Republican. And they think these people are just as bad, whether they're Democrat or Republican. There's no reform really possible there. So it's not going to come bottom up. It's not going to come top down. It's not going to come from the side, from the courts. There's a very, interesting moment in the history of the Constitution when 2 days before the Constitution is published to the American people, the way to amend the Constitution is exclusively through Congress. Only Congress can propose an amendment of the Constitution. George Mason stands up and says, well, wait a minute, what if Congress is the problem? Because if Congress is the problem and they're the only ones that can amend it, then we're stuck. And it was a kind of first time there was a Homer Simpson's duh moment in the history of American politics where they hit their head and they said, yeah, that's right. And they created a convention clause to give the states the power to call in a convention.
It's Article 5.
Article 5, to have a convention to propose amendments to the Constitution. That's a mechanism, but of course most Americans are terrified about the idea of an Article 5 convention. I'm not, but most
That's
are.
what drove you in this very room.
Yeah, we had this conversation here, that's right, yeah. About the Article 5 convention.
It was called the Con.
That's right. Yeah, something like that.
The Constitutional Convention
Conference. Yes, right.
Yes. And if you're against it, you're con.
But the idea that we're going to have an Article 5 convention to deal with Congress strikes most people as kind of crazy. So here we are. I think, most people see there's a problem. This is an institution that bounces around single-digit approval ratings. It's a bankrupt institution. But what is the solution to that problem? And so as I was pushing this idea forward of a referendum through a referendum candidacy, and people were constantly saying to me, yeah, it's crazy, stupid, idiotic, you don't understand the way, blah, blah, blah. My constant feeling, sometimes expressed, most of the time just in the middle of the night, thinking this as I couldn't sleep, was, well, what is your solution to the problem then? It's this great scene in Game of Thrones where Jon Snow, in response to the claim it's a terrible plan, he says, yeah, you're right. It's a bad plan. What's your plan? That was me. I wanted to say.
And then things turned out really well for Jon Snow.
No, but we don't know that yet. Don't you know anything? We don't know that yet. So
wait a minute. Is your campaign dead?
You'll have to wait till the next season to know.
Wow. It could come back.
We'll see.
Huh. There are microphones positioned on stands, and since C-SPAN is indeed recording this, for you to jump in would require going to that microphone or that microphone. So feel free to go up to it, and it sounds as if questions about the campaign, speculation about the next season of Game of Thrones, or ideas on if you accept Larry's version of both the problem, the potential substantive solution, about which an academic can write a book, but there's still the question of the mechanics of doing it, it'd be great to hear about that. So why don't we start here? Feel free to tell us who you are.
My name is Erin Riley, and I'm not affiliated with Harvard Law School in any way, so I'd be curious to know why the courts can't do anything.
Well, of course, the courts could fix the problem that gave rise to super PACs, and they should. But an important part of, my view of the problem is that that's not enough. That's nowhere close to enough. That what we have to do is change the way campaigns are funded. And the courts don't have the power to order Congress to pass public funding of campaigns. It's not within their ken. And the courts don't have the power, according to their jurisprudence, to tell Congress it's got to change the way it's drawing districts. I mean, it might come to the place where it's able to challenge districts as politically gerrymandered, as inconsistent with the Constitution, but that's not enough, right? So it takes real leadership, and this is, part of my view of where we liberals, I think, sometimes have made a big mistake. The history of the last 40 years, or 50 years maybe, of liberal jurisprudence has been whenever there's a problem, let's race to the court and get 5 justices to give us the right answer. As opposed to, let's go to the American people and convince the American people of what the right answer is, and then get the Democratic branches to give us the right answer. Well, I think here, it's both because it's necessary and because it's the only way it sticks, that we got to go to the people and say to the people, this problem is something you've got to get your Congress to fix, and they're the ones who are going to have to fix it.
Yes, right here.
Hi, I'm Axel Pinto. I'm a student at the business school. I wanted to ask you if you have any call for action for the people here assembled. I think we all pretty much agree that campaign finance is the defining issue of this political system. So I don't know if you have any specific items that you think people here could do.
Yeah, so I appreciate that. And I guess I would, there's lots of particulars I could point you to. Again, the Citizen Equality Act project, Citizens for Equality is the site where you can sign up and help that. But beyond particular organizations, we've got to find a way to change the discourse about this issue, right? So to make it urgent that people focus on the need to fix this democratic problem first. And that means really pressing candidates. That means whenever any candidate talks, it's not just about them saying, here's what the right answer is. It's also about them explaining how they're actually going to bring that answer about. The striking, frustrating thing to me about, again, the Democratic debates is not once has any candidate mentioned the word public funding of elections. Not once. Yet that is the only solution within the horizon of the Supreme Court changing or an amendment of the Constitution that could make any difference here. Yet this issue is not at the center, and because it's not at the center, most people don't even recognize that there is a solution which actually they could do something if we created the pressure.
And just for those who haven't been living and breathing this, it was interesting when you pointed out that multi-member districts are not just some innovation in some other country. They were part of the original republic. Public funding of elections is also not foreign to the U.S. It's something, is it done in the presidency races?
Well, right. We forget that every president between Nixon and Obama was elected with presidential public funding. Nobody benefited more from it than Ronald Reagan, who ran 3 national campaigns with presidential public funding. There would have never been Ronald Reagan had it not been presidential public funding, because in 1976, the Republican Party was not going to fund a right-winger taking on a sitting Republican president. But the most striking thing about that history is when Ronald Reagan ran for re-election, he attended 8 fundraisers. When Barack Obama ran for re-election, he attended 220 fundraisers. Right? So you just think about the difference in the lives of candidates between these two systems. And I think this is, putting aside the question of how do you run the most difficult job in the country, while attending 220 fundraisers, like, I think I want some of our money back for the salary here. But the point is, it's completely distorting from the perspective of who these people are talking to, right? Because 220 fundraisers were not with randomly selected Americans. These are 220 fundraisers with the tiniest slice of the 1%.
And for congressional elections, is there public funding right now?
No.
No, it's only been in the presidency, and
That's right.
the outside money, I gather, Obama opted out of public funding at one point?
Yeah, Obama opted out. That's what basically ended presidential public funding.
Wow. So Reagan ushered it in, and Obama ushered it out.
Well, Reagan took advantage of it. Nixon
is the
what
one who
caused
So we have Nixon to thank for public funding and Obama to curse for
That's right.
weird times. Yes, sir.
If I was an evangelical pastor at a megachurch, I'd be really excited about democracy vouchers because all of my parishioners would have $100 to spend on campaigns. If I was a Black Lives Matter organizer, I'd be really excited about democracy vouchers because everyone that showed up at my march would now have $100 to throw a fundraiser right there for a candidate. So it seems like democracy vouchers are a really great organizing tool to reach out across the aisle to racial justice groups, to evangelicals, to anyone who has people but not money. Why haven't we surfaced democracy vouchers as a solution, which seems much more exciting than campaign finance reform as a problem?
So this will also be a test of you as a candidate. Can you explain democracy vouchers in 3 or 4 tweets?
So democracy vouchers is a form of public funding. In fact, Seattle just passed a voucher proposal giving everybody $100 worth of vouchers for city elections. And so what this is, when I described it in my book, I said, let's take the first $50 of everybody's taxes, and everybody pays at least $50 to the federal government, rebate it in the form of a voucher, and you use that voucher to help fund candidates who agree to take vouchers and small contributions. And you're right, I think it has enormous potential to rally people around an alternative to the way we fund campaigns right now, but it requires candidates to be willing to talk about it. And I can tell you the first thing that consultants say to you when you say, I want to talk about changing the way campaigns are funded, or something called, quote, public funding, is that, this will kill you, politically kill you. And the truth is, I think for most of the last 50 years, that might have been the case. But I think we are finally at a place where Americans are so deeply frustrated with the existing system, they're open to talking about a different idea. And that's why what happened in Seattle was so incredibly important. There's a public referendum on the idea of democracy vouchers, won overwhelmingly because people in Seattle were so frustrated with the big money controlling.
And just thinking about it strategically, the premise of the question was that both the left and the right, who otherwise don't agree on anything, might say, I might like to play this game rather than the chicken pecking game.
Right. The real difference in American politics is not between the right side and the left side. The real difference is between the inside and the outside. And on the outside, right-wing organizers and left-wing organizers love the idea of this kind of people-powered funding of elections. There's a guy named Richard Painter who's on a board of a group called Take Back the Republic. They're all right-wing organizers trying to organize public funding of elections at this level. Richard has something he calls the Taxation Without Representation Act. He said, this is the real Tea Party. We've got a system where people are being taxed without being represented because the only people represented are the people funding campaigns. So everybody should get a $200 voucher that they use to fund campaigns, and unless you get a voucher, you shouldn't have to pay taxes. Okay, so this is a very right-wing, appropriate way to talk about the issue, and they're building a huge right-wing support for this at the grassroots level. But when you get to the inside, people on the inside, it's not that they're evil, it's just they don't have time to think about an alternative system when they're in the middle of a 2-year election cycle, and they're trying to figure out how they're going to win the next election. So that's why we on the outside have got to build the support, the movement to allow them to think differently about this, because otherwise they just have no time and they won't do it.
Yes, sir.
Professor, thanks for taking the time and being pretty frank today. I have 2 questions. One, I'm wondering if you think your candidacy will spur more single-issue referendum candidates, both on the congressional and presidential level, and if that's necessarily a good thing or if that leads to potentially a slippery slope. I'm also wondering, you had mentioned that, especially when it comes to primaries, you get more of a far right or far left voting population in that. I'm wondering if you think there would be a distinct benefit from whether it would be legislating a federal holiday for primary or even national votes for election days so that you can actually have a more representative population.
Yeah, so this idea, Bernie has pushed this idea, and the Citizen Equality Act supports the idea of moving to a holiday for voting, and I think it's, it's obviously makes sense to equalize the opportunity to vote. So I absolutely support that. With respect to the first, I mean,
it wouldn't be a holiday voucher that if you're going to take the day off, you have to go to the polls?
You have to go to Florida to vote. It's like you have to take a whole vacation to vote, and you get a free trip to Disney World. But with respect to the first issue, technically you're right. This was a single-issue campaign in the sense that the revolution was a single-issue revolution, right? I mean, yeah, it was single-issue, but it was fundamental to every other issue. And so I don't support the idea of, single issue. I'm going out there, the only issue I care about is climate change, even though I think climate change is a critical issue. I mean, I don't support that idea. But I do think that when you're at a place where you see the system itself is broken, we have to have a way to talk about how do we fix that system. And so, all the time I would try to talk about it like that, and I would instantly be put into this, well, you're just a single-issue candidate box. And, I didn't have the skill, I didn't even know how to do it, to get out of that box, to get people to see that it's, yes, in some sense, single issue, but no, it's not an insignificant issue because it's a single issue. It's the only issue, not because it's the most important issue, but it's because unless you fix this issue, we don't get to solve any of the other issues that you're talking about. So the frustrating thing when I watch, people interview candidates on television, like, Bernie would be interviewed and people would say, how are you ever going to pay for single-payer health care? And I would be like, why is that the question? Why isn't the question, how would you ever pass single-payer health care when we know Congress is owned by exactly the interests that would never allow that to happen? How are you going to, what's the particular system you're going to adopt to break up the banks? What do you mean? You're never going to break up the banks so long as the largest funders of congressional campaigns come from Wall Street, right? The point is, the press would never focus on the really important practical question, which was the core, I thought, of this whole campaign, which is we don't have a political system that's responsive to what the people want. So we have presidential candidates who pretend they're running to get to the votes from the people to tell them what they should do without addressing the fact that regardless of what they want to do, they're not going to do any of it because the essential institution in the middle is completely corrupted and destroyed.
I see we have at least 9 questions pending. So
All right, I'll talk faster. Great.
that's the solution. Is there anything that more words can't solve? Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Max, this is Guy. We are leaders of Wolfpack, Massachusetts. As you've alluded to, we are the group which is trying to get an Article 5 convention to pass a 28th Amendment to get money out of politics, definitively. First of all, we'd like to thank you very much for your support of the Young Turks, of Cenk, of Wolfpack. Secondly, I'd like to make a shameless plug. If you'd like to do something about it, please join us. We've already got 4 states to call for a convention, 5 states halfway. We're doing great in Massachusetts. We're going to win, and we're going to change history. And Professor Lessig is a supporter of us, and he will be the godfather of our movement. And third, a question.
I think that might be...
How do we get people to look past the glamour of presidential politics and to actually engage in the states where voter turnout is very low and where people don't really pay attention and don't care that much?
Got it.
Yeah, I mean, that's really hard. But here's the really hardest problem of the Article 5 convention movement, which you're right. I've worked with Wolfpack, gone to state legislatures. I've testified at state legislatures to get them to pass the amendments. Every time we've done this, they've actually done the proposal to call for an Article 5 convention. But that process, too, has become essentially polarized. There's like right-wing calls for a convention, balanced budgets, ending all sorts of things that they don't like on the right wing. And there are left-wing calls for a convention, which is basically the one that we've participated in, to change the way campaigns are funded. And unless we have a way to call for a convention that is not politically polarized, it's certain to die. And this is why. Like, if the right succeeds in getting 34 states to call for a convention, it will be the biggest gift to the Democratic Party's fundraising apparatus since the Iraq War. Because what the Democratic Party will do is to say, oh my gosh, this Tea Party convention is going to take away all of our rights. Give us money so we can go fight them. And the same thing on the other way around. If we actually got to 34 states, then the right would say, oh my gosh, these liberal crazies are going to take over our Constitution and turn us into a socialist republic, and a democratic socialist republic. But again, it would be all about, falling into the partisan frame, fundraising frame, and destroy the possibility of how we're actually going to make progress on this. So one of the most important things Wolfpack has tried to do again and again is to frame this in a way that's open to issues from the right and the left being presented. And until we can get to a place where people on the right realize, the way I think people on the left have, that we need to make this into a cross-partisan event, I fear it's going to go nowhere.
A cross-partisan event that would somehow limit the aim of the gathering.
You have to make it possible to have, I think, fiscal responsibility issues. That's what the right cares about. And electoral integrity issues. That's what the left cares about. Both of those at the convention. If you have both of those at the convention, you can propose from either of them. Neither side should care because, it takes 38 states to ratify whatever the convention does, which is a large number. When you think, it's basically 13 states, one house in 13 states can block any amendment. So it's not like any crazy right-wing amendment or any crazy left-wing amendment is going to ever get through. So that structure should be amenable to them. But we are so trained to think, as Mark Meckler said here on the stage when he presented this, we are so trained to think with the politics of hate, where we are focused on how we hate the other side, that the idea of working with the other side to do something as important as a constitutional Article 5 convention seems impossible to most people.
Got it. Yep.
They pretty much asked what I was going to ask, which is about Wolfpack, your thoughts on Wolfpack. So I will ask you, what can we do to push this issue forward, get money out of politics, as citizens? Because obviously our politicians don't care what we think unless you're part of the super rich, which I know I'm not. What
Got it.
do you have?
Yeah, I think the thing, we've got to find a way to push this demand that they talk about the solution. It's not enough to talk about the problem. We got the frame, the billionaires have taken over American democracy. We get that. Everybody gets that. Literally, 93% of America will say they get that, right? But the question now is, what is the solution? And we should be saying that to every single candidate because the Republicans get it too, right? The Republicans, after Donald Trump basically said he owned every one of them, they all are now willing to talk about the fact that money has corrupted this process, and they acknowledge this problem. So the question all of us have to press every time we can is, okay, what is your solution? And when typically a Democrat will say something like this, when their solution is, we're going to amend the Constitution and overturn Citizens United, say, well, what is our solution in this century, right? Because I am all for the movements that are talking about how to fix the constitutional problem through those means. But we don't have time to wait for that. We've got to have a democracy that can actually function in 2017. That's what we need. And so the question they've got to answer is, what changes will we make now, in the next Congress, that could get us a government that could begin to govern again?
And Larry, what's your theory as to why this isn't catnip to the media? Is it that there's just enough issues to ask about ISIS or whatever that this just is boring, or is it something else?
There's this amazing framing the media gives to this. And the media's framing is, people don't care about this issue. And they will say again and again, the public will in some sense say they care about money and politics, but when you ask them about the most important issues, they will never list this. Okay, that was true in 1994 and in 1996. But YouGov did a poll, Democratic voters, they asked, if the next president could do just one thing, what should that one thing be? And by far, over any other issue, the one thing was fixing the corrupted way we fund campaigns. This issue is now right at the very top, but there's nobody to discipline the media about this, to get them to sort of recognize the salience of this, so they continue to frame it in a way that makes this issue invisible. And that, again, I think is part of the opportunity that I wanted to have the chance in the debate to press this so that you could begin to get the recognition in the public that would get people to do something about it, but obviously that didn't happen.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So both the right and the left do agree that this is a big issue. So why is it that it's become partisan, and how do we change that?
It's become partisan because everything is partisan. So in 2014, Harry Reid needed to raise a bunch of money for the Senate Democrats. So what did he do? In August, early September, he brought to the floor of the United States Senate a proposal to amend the Constitution to overturn Citizens United. Okay, so here was an amendment to the Constitution designed to address the problem of money in politics that was brought to the floor of the Senate to make it easier to raise money for democratic politics, recognizing that doing that would have zero chance of attracting any Republican support for a bill that requires 2/3 of the Senate to have any chance of passing. So why was he doing it? Well, he was doing it because it advanced the interests of the Democratic Party. Does advancing the interests of the Democratic Party make it more likely that we will win on this issue? No. So the problem is that the interests in this partisan scheme are not necessarily consistent with us winning on this interest, which is why I think we've got to find a way to build a kind of citizen political movement, citizen politicians, people who are not politicians, not wannabe politicians, people on the outside who are demanding this kind of change because people on the inside live according to a different economy, and the economy is just what benefits partisan interests here, and that's making it impossible for us to make progress.
Would you consider a third-party run?
The problem in America today is it's practically impossible to imagine a third-party run. The rules the Debate Commission have set for being in the general election debate are so restrictive that even Ross Perot could not qualify to be, would not have qualified.
What do you need in the polls?
You have to be 15% in the polls before they'll allow you to be in the debate. And of course, the 15% is measured just before the debate, which means that nobody has any incentive to support a candidate when you've got to begin to support a candidate like that, which would be now, because the chance of getting to 15% before the debate just seems so unlikely. So, this is a consequence, again, of the Democrats and Republicans working together to basically mean that they own the field. So that makes it really incredibly hard to imagine doing something like that. But, I think I and many people here are going to do whatever the hell it takes, right? Whatever it takes, whatever crazy intervention is possible to force this issue and to make this change. And, we'll see what seems possible.
Yep.
Yes, Professor Lessig, you observed that a large part of the American public is not represented because if you're a Republican or represented by a Democratic congressperson, your representative doesn't much care about you. I think that's inaccurate, or maybe an incomplete observation, because I find that as a Democrat in a represented by a Democratic representative, my representative doesn't care about me either.
Always nice to find a silver lining.
I mean, what I've observed over the years is that at election time, if I happen to be a baby, they'll kiss me. If they may want to shake my hand and have about a 3-word conversation with me, but if I want to have a substantive discussion with them when they want my vote, they're too busy. If it's not when they want my vote, I get shunted off to some aide who's probably an underpaid intern, recently, either high school or college, or college student, who never passes, my comments on to the representative. So, as an American citizen, my thoughts on anything don't count for anything.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, what you're expressing and what the applause expresses is this deep recognition, acknowledgement we all seem to have about the flaw, the failure of this democracy, right? Some people feel it more than others. The first campaign stop that I did was at Ferguson, Missouri. and the opportunity to spend 3 hours in the basement with the people who had organized the protest after the Ferguson tragedy was 3 hours experiencing a level of disconnect with our political system 1,000 miles greater than anything you are describing, right? So this is the natural state of America's democracy right now, people not represented. And so you might be right that Democrats are not represented just like Republicans are not represented regardless of the seat, but this is our feeling. Now, we could give up to say this is just democracy, it doesn't work. And in fact, I've been at events where very rich people say we ought to give up. We ought to just forget the idea of democracy, do what China does, kind of have technocratic solutions to every problem. But I think what we ought to do is to try representative democracy for once. We've not yet tried it. We've never tried it really. We've never included people equally, really, African Americans, women, the poor. But if we actually tried it and embraced the idea of equality inside of our political system, I want to see if in 50 years after that happens, we have a better feeling about the way democracy works. And so one last shot. Let's try once for a really representative democracy and see what we can get from it. And if it doesn't work, okay, then we can think about, the internet or something like that as a solution.
Well, I'd just like to say I applaud you for trying to get us from here to there.
Thank you.
We are. And we're just beginning from here to there. That's right.
So we don't have a whole lot of time left, and I want to make sure that the few who have filtered out didn't eat all the food. So I'd like to take the three here and the one here, maybe, and then save the rest for when we adjourn. Yes, sir.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you for everything that you have done, continue to do. Congress is corrupt, incompetent, lots of words we could use. What is the solution? Belgium has an interesting idea. They are going to be selecting from the citizenry people to be in their Senate. I think that's a brilliant idea. The ancient Greeks did it, sortition. I don't see why we couldn't do it as a stepping stone from here to there, because obviously that's not going to happen overnight, and is something that might potentially, give you oomph to, for an independent run.
A citizen Senate, what do you think?
So he was actually talking about sortition, which...
but leads to a citizens' assembly.
Yeah,
We've done these all over. It's 2/3 citizens, 1/3 elected.
So I love the idea in principle, and I want to try it right away through something like, it's called deliberative polls, which Jim Fishkin have described. And I would love to see one convened tomorrow, randomly selecting 500 people from around the country to focus on what constitutional changes we should bring about to deal with the problems of American democracy tomorrow. And I think you would see out of that process, actually, ordinary citizens are pretty good at figuring out what the right answer is when given the right information and an opportunity to talk about it in a fair and representative way. So I'm all for this kind of experiment. And if we did it repeatedly, I think there would be more confidence to turning more of the government over to effectively a better jury system than the jury system which convicts people and sends them to jail.
There was a show.
Yes, I'm sorry, we got to keep it moving. Yes.
Good evening, Sheldon Fisher. I'm an alumnus. When I heard of your candidacy, it kind of made me feel good. I heard you had raised about $1 million, and I believe that made you feel pretty good. So if you don't mind if I refer to you as Dr. Feelgood. And I mean that most respectfully. In this country, and perhaps throughout this world, there's very little you can do in a profession without having taken an exam of some sort. You can't get a driver's license. You can't practice medicine, and certainly not law. You see my point, or accountancy. I would advocate, sir, if one day you could become president of these United States, that I could shake your hand as you took your oath of office at the United States Congress, and in your inaugural address, you suggested that there needed to be a comprehensive exam that dealt with war, nuclear and other, the history and geography of the world, the cultures of the world, and that anyone who dares to think they can be president needs to prove to the people that he has some, or she has some real sense in their head, like we've all had to prove to get through our various exams throughout life. Because other than wearing a suit really well, I don't see that there's much in the way of real pre-qualifications, if you will, to become president of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you.
So,
what he's describing is supposed to be called the campaign process,
well,
right?
it's supposed to be called
That's the vetting,
What it's
yes.
supposed to be called is the media. That's
Yes.
what the media is supposed to do. And if the media did its job, we would have that comprehensive exam process, as people would have to demonstrate that they had some depth. Now, what scares me is that even where you do see some efforts by the media to measure whether people have any understanding of certain pretty critical issues, it's not clear the public's reacting to that, right? So the public doesn't seem to care much about the fact that Donald Trump doesn't know shit about what he's talking about. Doesn't care about that fact.
And Larry, were you prepared, if you had made it into the debates, as each question was asked, ISIS, this,
Yes,
health
of course.
care, that,
Yeah.
would each of your answers be, look, the first thing we have to do is fix campaign finance reform, or would you give substantive answers on each of those?
No, every one of these issues I would give a substantive answer. I sat down and wrote out the policy papers that include all of these issues. But the obvious point is to weigh all of those issues tie back to this issue of the money. So it's to make the right answer clear and to show why the right answer is not an answer we can get until we solve this problem of the corrupting influence of money first.
Got it. Let's take the last two here that I mentioned and then wrap up.
Thank you. Thank you for running for president. I hope that many follow in your steps. My impression of what happened to your campaign is that you were denied access by the polling companies and by the party. And not only were you denied access, but also seemingly very arbitrarily. And it seems to me that there was a point in the campaign between sort of when you knew that it wasn't going to move forward, but before you dropped out, that you could have sued someone, sued someone not to help yourself, but to help the next person.
The most American of remedies.
We are at the law school, after all.
Did you think about suing?
In fact, a lawyer called me and said, I'll sue. It's just not the nature of the problem, in my view. It's not, I'm a law professor, I love the law, I love lawyers, I love the idea of making justice work. But I want to make democracy work. So the idea that, you would go and imagine a court ordering the Democratic Party to do something is just not the way I'd want to win.
Same
right?
idea on demanding equal time under some of the rusty communications laws for, SNL gives time to Hillary, don't you get time too?
Yeah, well, of course, that strategy was earlier than at the point he was talking about. That strategy was part of the process of trying to get enough attention to get to the 1% in the polls. Right?
Yes.
But so you're right. There might be a legal action, and you're right. It might be the right thing for someone to do, but it wasn't the thing that I wanted to do. I wanted to win. I wanted to make this fight about the democratic process, and the fight's not over. We'll see. We'll see where this goes.
Last question. Yes.
All right. Thank you. My name is Jasper Burns. I'm a student at Boston University. A lot of what you've been focusing on is on the federal level, and I was just wondering if there's anything that should or could happen on the state or local level.
Yeah, so the only exciting stuff is happening at the state or local level right now. So Seattle passed vouchers. Maine passed a referendum to reinforce their public funding of elections. Connecticut Democrats toyed with the idea of removing their public funding proposal, and within 2 days, the uproar at the outrage of that idea forced them to back down from it. We had victories in Tallahassee in the last election where they passed an anti-corruption statute. All of this is happening at the local level, I think, much more effectively than at the federal level. But here's the concern I have at the local level. I support these movements 100%. But we have to recognize the problem might be different in Vermont from in Congress, right? And the answers might be different for Vermont versus Congress. I mean, Vermont, Congress is like New York, maybe, or like Illinois. And so, I'd be happy to generalize there. But if we build a movement that focuses just at the local level and we solve the local problems, I fear people won't see how radically different and harder the federal problem is. So what I think we need to do is to work on all of these at the same time. We've got to be pushing at the federal level and at the state level and at the local level, but rallying around this idea that we deserve a democracy responsive to us equally. That's the idea that should unite all of these. And as we fight for that, and we build this recognition outside of the political the Beltway of Washington, I believe we begin to have the power to actually win. So that's fantastic, but it's not enough. And obviously nothing we've done so far is enough. But the truth is, even though this was a very difficult campaign, it was the best of times and the worst of times, right? So cable news was the worst of times,
right?
Yeah, that's right. Cable news was the worst of times. That was not an experience to be loved. But the experience of talking to voters, experiences like this, the experience of like talking to groups of 10 people or in an old folks home, that is the most rewarding experience I think I've ever had, because the deep, genuine passion people have about getting a democracy they can respect or feels is responsive to them, to follow up on that other question, is really empowering. It convinces me we could win this issue. We did a poll. We found 96% of Americans believe it important to reduce the influence of money in politics. 91% don't think it's possible. That's the politics of resignation. But the politics of resignation gives you a perfect strategy for winning, which
led to a campaign of resignation.
That's right, the resignation campaign. Yeah. Okay, that wasn't the perfect campaign, but the point is, it's still in the perfect direction of like, how do we thaw that resignation? Because once we do, then I think we have a real chance of winning.
So that's an amazing bookend of sort of hope at the end as the blood pools around Jon Snow. But spoiler alert, sorry. But we framed this as lessons learned. And if Doctor Who showed up and took you back to July of 2015, what, if anything, would you do differently?
Yeah, you're going to have to wait for that. I don't know. I'm too close. Too close. I am so grateful for the opportunity. And given that the gamble was, could we get into the debates, we qualified. So that gamble was worth it. It didn't turn out to get us into the debates. All right, fine. But still, the gamble was worth it. And costly, but worth it. One more strategy on the way to figuring the one strategy that will finally make it so we win.
Well, our notion of a citizen stepping forward to say, hat in the ring, let's give this a go, that is an inspirational notion that you rarely see coming from people, particularly people who, frankly, are well ensconced within the elite. I am not surmising about your bank account, but certainly as far as the level of success you have attained in the world and to be willing to step forward and do it is quite extraordinary. And I'm trying to think of any other example in which that has happened. Can you think of one?
Let's think of that later.
On that somewhat contemplative note, please join me in thanking Larry Lessig.
Thanks, Casey.